The study that I'm going to be looking at is a study that is called Family Rejection as a Predictor of Suicide Attempts and Substance Misuse Among Transgender and Gender Nonconforming Adults. And this was published in LGBT Health. An article was written under the title Family Acceptance Saves Lives. And the study that I'm mentioning is referring to rejection. So the underlying idea is that the article author believed that the opposite of rejection is acceptance, which makes sense. And so let's look more directly as to what is rejection defined as according to this study. And this was done by the Human Rights Campaign, which is a very popular website. In the article, it mentions, according to a 2016 study published in LGBT Health, family rejection increases the odds of substance misuse and suicide attempts in transgender and gender nonconforming people. And this is how it is framed. So let's look to see what family rejection entails. According to this research study, they found that there hasn't been a lot of research when it comes to focusing on family-based stigma and discrimination of transgender people. The hypothesis of the researchers was that rejection from family members may have negative effects on health outcomes for two different reasons. Just the family rejection in and of itself is a big stressor, and that could have negative impacts. When someone is being rejected by their family or close loved ones, that's going to provide less buffering effects and resilience that are usually received from that social support. So if society or if there's other discrimination, then it's going to be harder for the trans individual to feel supported if they don't even have that at home. There were two separate health outcomes that were measured: suicide attempts and substance misuse. The researchers used a survey, and it's called the National Transgender Discrimination Survey. And this was done by the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force and Transgender Equality. The participants were gathered from community and venue-based sites like an LGBT center and snowball sampling, which is basically when one individual is given the survey and they can then share the survey with other people that they know, and those people that get it can also share it, and so it just snowballs, as the name implies, to more and more people. And it basically makes it a challenge because it's going to be spread to people that kind of have similarities within each other, within their groups. The sample size of the full survey was 6,456 from all 50 states. Once the researchers received those surveys back, they excluded certain participants. So 737 of them were excluded because, in other words, they didn't identify as transgender anymore. And that could be a problem if we're going to generalize these findings to rejection and acceptance. Another group that was not allowed in the study was 107 individuals were removed because they were missing data from either the family rejection variable or other health outcomes. This was another shortcoming of the study. Within the study, the survey, there were 7 questions used to assess the family's response to their coming out as transgender or gender nonconforming. And all of these questions were predicated upon that fact. So initially, before the questions were asked, the participants were given this prompting, which is, as a response to their coming out, how did their family respond? The first question was, my relationship with my spouse or partner ended. The next one was, my ex limited or stopped my relationship with my children. My children chose not to speak with me or spend time with me. So those are all three very significant forms of rejection. My parents or family chose not to speak with me or spend time with me. I was a victim of domestic violence by a family member. My family is as strong today as before I came out. This was reverse coded because if they said that my family is as strong today, then that was seen as family acceptance rather than rejection. My relationships are slowly improving after coming out. So these were the 7 questions that were asked to ascertain if the family, quote, rejected the individual. And rejection can mean a lot of things to many people. And according to this design, that is what rejection would entail. So they were asked varying degrees of rejection amounts. So if a participant only scored 0 or 1, then that would be considered a low amount of rejection. One thing to note is that questions like, my family is as strong today as it was before I came out, they were scored exactly the same as if I was a victim of domestic violence. And as you can see, those are quite different. The next way of coding was moderate rejection. That's if there were 2 or 3 types of rejection noted. And again, questions like, my family is as strong today and my relationships are slowly improving were scored the same as I was a victim of domestic violence and my children chose not to speak with me. The last one is high rejection. They were going to be indicating 4 to 7 forms of rejection. And again, those different categories like my family is as strong today and my relationships are slowly improving were scored the same. Based on the results, 3,050 participants rated low amounts of rejection. It's 54.3. 1,758 participants indicated moderate amounts of rejection. That's 31.3%. And lastly, 804 participants indicated high amounts of rejection, 804, which would be 14.3% of the sample. The suicide attempts were measured, and the lifetime history of suicide attempts were found that participants were asked whether they had ever attempted suicide. 42.3% of this whole sample indicated that they had. It's just a very high amount. For the moderate rejection amount, the people that had moderate amounts of rejection had it 2.03 times more likely that they had attempted suicide than the low amount of rejection. When it comes to the high rejection, they were 3.02 times more likely to have attempted suicide than the low rejection. For substance misuse, the moderate rejection were 1.7 more times likely than the low. And for high rejection, they were 2.3 times more likely to use substances or misuse substances than the low. Other suicide risk associations were found as well, aside from being rejected. If a trans individual was younger age, a binary gender identity, non-white race, ethnicity, lower education and income, and being unemployed, those were all found in this survey to be associated with more suicide attempts. For substance misuse associations, non-white race, ethnicity, lower education and income, and being unemployed were all associated with higher levels of substance misuse. The summary from the researchers, they indicated these data suggest that family acceptance or the absence of family rejection may have a protective effect for transgender individuals. And you can see how this might be misconstrued, as acceptance and rejection have different meanings. Let's look closer. For example, with question 1, the rejection would be summarized as being broken up with, or a divorce, or something serious like that. So the opposite of that would be staying together or not divorcing. For question 2, the question could be summarized as child estrangement, and the acceptance would be not estranging. For question 3, they were shunned by their child, and so acceptance would be don't shun them. And this was being question 4, they were shunned by their whole family, and acceptance would be not shunning them. Question 5 was violence and abuse, even from domestic violence. So the acceptance form would be not having violence. For question 6, a stronger family was indicated, and that was a summary of that. So the rejection in that case would be a less strong family, whatever that means. What would it mean to be a strong family? What about coming out made it less strong? There wasn't really nuance in that question. For question 7, the last one, stronger relationships were indicated. And that would be a summary. And so rejection would be less strong relationships. What would it mean to have a strong relationship? And what about coming out made it less of a positive relationship? According to the researchers, the study was not designed to test the mechanisms by which familial rejection may be associated with negative health outcomes. And a mechanism is a natural or established process by which something takes place or is brought about. There were some study limitations according to the researchers. Firstly, it was not a randomized experimental design, which is the best way to help establish a more causal relationship. The study had a large amount of white, educated, and employed participants, and that limits the generalizability of the findings. The cross-sectional nature of the data did not allow us to determine any causal relationship between family rejection and the negative health-related outcomes. And up above, you can see that there's the cross-sectional study, which is 1 point at one time, versus longitudinal, which is over time. How did those things change? And that could be a little bit more supported in this evidence. No information about the time frame within which the family rejection occurred. So as a result of coming out, there might have been a breakup immediately, or it could have happened over 5 years after that point. And it's very difficult to pinpoint a causal relationship about that, because relationships can be complicated. Domestic violence can also have other factors, alcohol or substance use. It doesn't discuss what precipitated those events directly in the study. The other aspect is we don't know the severity of the rejection or whether this changed over time. We don't know how these factors might have influenced these results. Another limitation was that 1.6% of the participants were not included in the analysis, like I mentioned before, because they did not complete certain questions. According to the researchers, the lack of validated measures could have resulted in misclassification of information and non-comparability of data to other studies that have standardized instruments. This was the first questionnaire used in this form. Similar to other studies, there was no control group. This wasn't an experimental design. And no transgender individuals, of course, who committed suicide were included in this study. So the question is, does family acceptance, per se, save lives of trans teens? This study did not fully answer this question because rejection versus acceptance have different meanings. And so at the bare minimum level, it could be seen that ostracizing or having violence or something very severe like shunning can have a negative impact on someone's mood, of course, and that's basically what this study was able to find. Thank you so much, and subscribe for more information.